Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, Phyllis and Richard L. Gelb, the Malkin Fund, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America and Rudolph Finn. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and as I've had reason to say quite often of late, by way, I suppose, of summing up my own life's work, essentially I'm a teacher, one might say even in this broadcasting role, though on a larger scale here than in a traditional classroom. As a teacher, I seek mostly to open my own mind and the minds of my viewers to the ways my guests can best set forth and elaborate upon their thoughts about the seminal issues of our times. And I don't usually challenge those views except for the sake of clarification. But today is different. Today my open mind guest is once again Daniel Callahan, philosopher, ethicist, co-founder and longtime director of the prestigious Hastings Center, renowned for its continuing examination of ethical issues in science and society. This time, I'm really going to challenge my old friend and his new book from the University of California Press, What Price Better Health? Hazards of the Research Imperative. Indeed, given how counterintuitive his title seems to me at least, I'm going to push Dan Callahan very hard to tell us in the most specific terms, chapter and verse if he will, just what the downside could possibly be of America's ever-growing support of better health and the ways to achieve it. Dan, you're on the spot.
Well, I'll give you one downside right away. We have very rapidly rising healthcare costs, going up 10 to 15% a year for the past few years. The number of uninsured is increasing all the time. About 50% of this cost increase comes from new technologies and technological innovations introduced into the system. So it's great to have these technologies. They do change and improve our life, but they're beginning to create an economic fit. So that's for openers. Beyond that, I've gotten fascinated with the whole research enterprise and our love of research in this country and our belief that we have to have unlimited medical progress. And I've come to think, like a lot of things that are good, I suppose I've been fascinated by things that are good that have their bad side for much of my life. I think biomedical research does have terrific benefits, but it also carries with it an awful lot of temptations. And I'm kind of interested in exploring what the temptations are, what I call the shadows of this enterprise.
Temptations? Why do you call the shadows temptations?
I'll give you. Let me start with a simple historical example. It was one of the great debates over the past century has been on the use of human beings as research subjects in medicine. The scientific community argued for decades and decades that they simply couldn't, people were too dumb to be asked about the research, that you had to sacrifice a few lives to save other lives. And then, of course, along came the Nazi doctors who did all sorts of terrible things to people in the name of medical research. And then we had abuses here in the 50s and 60s of medical research. And in every case, the defense was, my gosh, we have to circumvent the moral rules because what we're doing, namely saving lives, relieving suffering, is such an ultimate good that it's worth paying the price. And the great revolution in that field was really came out of the Nuremberg trials, when it was really determined that it was no longer adequate to have human beings used as research subjects without their informed consent. That is to say, a doctor cannot work on you, do research with you, unless you say yes. And that is a hard and flat rule. And even if you say, even if the researcher says, but I could save thousands of lives if I could just do this research, and still the rule is not without my permission. So right away, there's a shadow side. Now, this issue has been debated 100 years, and yet still there are abuses. There are still people getting research done without their permission, still people dying from research where they have not been adequately told what the results would be. So that's sort of, it's a long chronic illness. And again, it's what I call a research imperative. My gosh, we are doing good things, therefore, it's the illness of, we have to break a few eggs to make an omelet kind of stuff.
But Dan, I when you mentioned that you have to make an omelet, you have to break eggs, I couldn't agree with you more in your hostility toward that. Suppose I said everything you just said. Yes, indeed, and indeed I can. Then where are you left with this matter of the research imperative? Because you have said yes to Callahan's concern about informed consent. You've said yes to Callahan's concern about human beings as the objects of research. You've eliminated that.
That's one area. I'll use some other examples. The pharmaceutical industry justifies its high drug prices on the grounds that they are saving lives, that they have a moral obligation to constantly find new drugs and treatments to save lives. And that's the argument they primarily use for their high prices. And the problem, of course, is there are a lot of people in our country and throughout the world, particularly with AIDS, who can't afford these drugs. They are dying because of their inability to pay for the drugs. So I find it just ridiculous that the pharmaceutical industries can talk about saving future lives while people are dying here and now because they will not make their products available at an affordable price. They claim the research imperative. It's the future lives that are more important in a funny way than the present lives.
But then I say yes again to Callahan. Right, okay. I love to say yes.
We've got two areas here, all right.
Very important areas, because I couldn't give a hoot in hell about the profits of the pharmaceutical industry. Let's nationalize the pharmaceutical industry or pharmaceutical research. We've eliminated the profit motive. Then the research imperative, what's the matter with it then?
I guess then the problem is deciding what you want to work on. The argument sometimes of many scientists or their supporters is that they should be able to work on anything they want because they're going to benefit us. And I guess can think of many things that would not be a benefit to us, but that their claim that they're going to do us good, they're going to satisfy our individual needs, it seems to me it gets pushed too far. And sometimes in order to do the research, they begin trampling on a lot of important values.
Yeah, but let me ask this. In that matter, since Callahan has already eliminated the profit motive, he's already eliminated experimentation on human beings, already eliminated the problem of consent, what difference does it make, except perhaps in the area of dollars? Is that your concern?
No, my concern really is, I suppose that there are two. One concern is simply at call it the somewhat lower level of cost and price and people's giving freedom and having choice. The higher level is, where is research going to take us? What kind of a world is it going to create for us? Do we in fact want to improve human intelligence, human memory? Do we want to double average life expectancy?
Do you know anyone who would say no to those questions?
Me.
That's what I really meant. Why?
There are plenty of people who would say no to those things.
Why?
If they thought about it. I think.
Why?
I suppose, first of all, to me, a very fundamental philosophical question is what really makes people happy in life. And I think an awful lot of the hype that comes from what science is going to do for us in the future, or the miseries it's going to relieve us of, or the better lives it's going to give us, really does not encompass a careful reflection on what, in fact, does make people happier, or, to me, more importantly, what leads to a good society. And I think an awful lot of the research that goes on in this country may satisfy individuals, may make them happy, but it is not necessarily creating a better society. And I guess when I look at medical research, my question is what will give the overall society better health? And then I get moved in the direction of public health, doing things that help the most people, much more primary care, much less high-tech genetic medicine, much more low-tech ability to visit a doctor inexpensively, to get inexpensive drugs and so forth and so on. So I suppose I start with the question of what do we really need in this world? And as far as I can see, we certainly could use some better health, but I don't see the greatest problem, at least in our developed countries, as a health problem. Our greatest problem is jobs, social violence, the fact we're at war. There are many social evils that seem to be greater than the biological evils.
Again, yes.
Well, you're
right.
You're half way there with me. But all I want to do is to say, look, the research enterprise is often presented as this pure, clean, unadulterated, wonderful thing, and you've already agreed, well, there are some problems. That's all I want to say.
But then
I want to pursue some of those problems.
But then let's handle the problems.
We can't get rid of, let's go back a bit.
Yeah.
The issue of human subject could be dealt with by international rules and regulations.
Right.
We're not going to get rid of the profit motive. Not the least chance in the world, much less in the United States, that we're going to get rid of the profit motive. And I don't think we would necessarily want to get rid of the profit motive in any and all respects anyway. But there's the possibility of actually controlling the profits of the drug industry, at least in this country, are nil. We've had total inability over the years in Congress to get any kind of price controls established. The Bush administration, even now in the new Medicare legislation, has been came out very favorable to the drug companies. They're a very powerful lobby, and unfortunately, we live in a society that loves the market, that loves profit. And so we're stuck with that one, I'm afraid.
How could you say that? How could you say we're stuck with that? Yes, well, that's where we are now.
We've had 200 years of it. And it's part of our culture. It goes back very far. You can trace it right back to Thomas Jefferson, in fact, the great individualist, and in fact, the great lover of the affluent life. And it's right in our history. Tocqueville talked about the American drive for money and profit. He said Americans talked about two things: money and religion. Really, it struck him.
Dan, if we had this discussion in 1932, perhaps I could be a little more sympathetic.
No.
But changes have taken place in our nation, a great sea change. Every time at the end of the program when I tell people where to write, and I tell them FDR station, my voice goes up. In fact, we have in the past had great social movements where changes have taken place. We've at least temporarily driven from the temple the money changers.
Some
temples. And from you.
Well, we haven't done it from the pharmaceutical or the medical device industry. And in fact, that's getting far worse than it used to be.
So let's do something about that.
I've been happy to do something about it, but nobody in Congress has figured out how to do anything about it. And even in the Democratic administrations, they don't succeed.
But you see,
I think it's very deep. I mean, I guess the problem is that there seem to be certain parts of our culture that are so deeply, I mean, freedom is far more important to us than justice. I'm interested to go to Europe, where they have every country has universal health care. They take it for granted that we should take care of our fellow citizens when we get sick. Americans have never taken that for granted, and that's why we have such a large number of uninsured. And I guess what to me is very distressing is it's been around for such a long time. It is deeply inbred. Now, I agree very much that there are social movements that have changed things. I think in my lifetime, your lifetime, civil rights, feminism, environmental movement, great social changes. But I must say, we haven't made nearly as much progress with the profit motive, and I think we've not made nearly as much progress in really trying to think through the problem of universal health care. And I think if we're going to think through that problem, we then have to think through the problem of rationing and limits and how we're going to actually fairly distribute the care we want to give everyone.
It seems to me, and it always has when we talk together, that there is still something more fundamental in your opposition to this kind of activity, and that is...
Well, it's not opposition, it's that I want it to be thought about in a more careful, nuanced fashion. I'm not against progress. I'm a beneficiary. I'm alive because of lots of progress.
Yes, but it seems to me that you might not say progress is marked by the fact that you or I, that we're still living. You seem...
Well, I can see some of the benefits of it, but I'm really asking the question, what is the overall benefit for us as a society with these developments?
You mean that you and I are still around?
Well, that's one part. Okay, you and I are still around, but actually there are a large number of scientists now that are trying to double life expectancy and do even more. Now, I don't think that's going to be of any great social benefit. It's not going to solve any of our contemporary problems. I don't know of any problem we have now that would be solved by having people live twice as long as they do now.
I guess you feel instead that it will exacerbate.
It will exacerbate. Oh, absolutely. I mean, we'll obviously have problems of job mobility. What are young people? How do you get into the system if you're going to have to wait years and years? We're going to have a large problem of basically, obviously, even if people are in pretty good health, they're still going to have some bad health. You're going to have years and years of providing health care. And I guess the question to me, which I can't answer, obviously, namely, would people actually be happier and better off if they had another 30 or 40 years? And that's, I look at my own peers and people older, and I ask, how long a life do you need to live to have a happy life? And as far as I can see, if you could make it to 70 or 80 thereabouts, you're not going to have incrementally more and more happiness just because you live more and more years. That's the way I think about it.
Which is it, 70 or 80?
Well, it's interesting.
Or 90.
I think I see things. 80 seems interestingly, with a lot of medical data, for things really begin changing around 80 for most people. They're always the 95-year-old guy in the Boston Marathon, but for most people, things do really begin declining after 80. Namely, they don't necessarily die, but their hearing gets bad, their eyesight gets bad, they have to urinate more frequently, they don't have the lung capacity they once did, the frailty begins. And you see all the signs.
Then suppose the medical people say, well, we can fix this.
Well, that's exactly
exactly
what they do say. And but then I still want to ask the question: A, is that a good way to invest our money? Will it? I do start with the question. When I look at our present society, I see all sorts of social problems, and I ask the question: will any of them be solved by improving longevity? And my answer is hard to see it. Other than you and I might like it, many of our fellow citizens, but as a social benefit, it seems to me it's going to create problems, not solve problems. So,
what would you do then, given that point of view? What would you do then to avoid the, perhaps unfair of me to call it, waste of our resources on keeping the 78-year-old fellow going? Once in our studio, when we were talking about this, I said, okay, I'm 68 then. And do you want to tell the hospital to turn me away instead of wasting resources?
Well, I understand by waste, namely doing something that really needn't be done if you did things better. Let's put it that way. Waste in the healthcare system, if you have a treatment which is excessive that's not benefiting the patient. I'm all in favor of, let me say two things here. I'm worried about the future of our Medicare system, whether it can keep growing in size and expenditures, particularly as the baby boom generation retires and the number of people under Medicare gets larger and larger. That's one problem. The other problem is, what do you do with the individual elderly patient? And
it all comes down to
it's not all waste. It seems to me that the fundamental question, which I wrestle with a lot with other people, is what actually counts as waste? Is the bypass surgery for a 90-year-old who's otherwise in good health and who will continue in good health, is that a waste? I'd say on the one hand, no, I think for the individual it's not a waste, and it's not a waste of doctors' time to perform the procedures. Whether we can afford a trend in this direction when the baby boomers retire, that's a separate kind of issue, but I don't consider it wasteful. And an awful lot of medicine, particularly an awful lot of medicine these days, it sort of gives us marginal benefits, usually at a very, very high price. Now, I've been very interested recently looking at new heart technologies. There are things, we're about to get an artificial implantable heart and defibrillators, very expensive stuff, which basically gives people maybe a few more months, maybe a few more years of life, but at an enormously high cost. Now the question is that a waste of money? Well, if you've got heart disease, it's not a waste of money. But if you're paying your taxes for that, you might think, well, maybe there are better things to spend money on in our society than $300,000. I mean, some of these procedures cost $300,000 and they'll add 3 months of life. Now, is that a good way to spend money? Well,
Dan, how are you going to deal with this? And I'm not quarreling with you now.
Well, it's interesting. I've spent a lot of time in Europe, and I'm fascinated to see how the Europeans do this, because they do. Everybody is guaranteed health care in Europe. And that means government control. Governments run the healthcare system. And basically they control it in great part by what the economists call the supply side. They limit available technology. They limit hospital beds. They make people pay a fair amount out of pocket, interesting, universal health care. That's a little sneaky side. Italy, about 30%. Israel around 35%. When you go to a hospital, you'll pay 35% of the bill yourself. They do it mainly by government controls, but that's Europe, and people will accept things happening, government doing things that we would never tolerate. But that's why I think we have universal health care. It has to be controlled by the government, and the way we'll control the cost is that they will simply turn off the spigot on certain new procedures, new technologies. They will be much more. They might say, we're not going to spend $300,000 to give somebody another 3 months of life. They might say that we just can't do that.
What about old procedures, like dialysis, for instance?
Well, dialysis is a wonderful case, but it's been a legend for some years that older and sicker. When dialysis first came in the early 70s, the expectation is it would cost about $400 million, and there'd be a limited number of people, and only younger people would be actually the beneficiaries. Well, as time has gone on, it's $1 billion. I don't know how many. It's many billions of dollars now. Most of the largest number of people now are older people on dialysis, people over 70. And the doctors often find this. The doctors who provided have been fascinating discussions with, because they say, look, we have lots of patients. We don't think it's a good idea to put them on dialysis. They're not going to live very long. They are in misery and they need the dialysis. On the other hand, life on dialysis is very unpleasant also. And they said, but we can't say no. If they want it and the government's going to pay for it, however useless we think this treatment is, they said,
would you say no?
If I were in their position, I would probably wimp out and say, no, okay, I would go along with the patient. But that's the I suppose the side of me, the doctor at the bedside, I think, has to think about these matters differently.
You're not in that position.
I'm not in that position.
The social philosopher.
I suppose I'm trying to think from the perspective of society. Namely, is that, again, to me, the interesting question is what else might we better spend the money on? We live in New York City, where you've got all sorts of schools that are falling down. Dialysis, you can get full coverage by the federal government if you have failing kidneys. And you can be right next to a high school that can't afford textbooks. That seems to me a bad set of priorities. So.
Therefore, I have to repeat, what would you do, Dan?
I would, if we could do it, I would have universal health care. I would have the government control the price of drugs. I would have government limit a fair number of procedures in order to...
Like dialysis.
Like dialysis, in order to keep everybody, make the universal health care possible. I don't think we can have universal health care unless we're prepared to say no to a lot of things.
Well, I guess that's the key point.
But see, that's the hard part for Americans to buy. And this, with the whole managed care, which got a lot of complaints in the 80s, particularly in the 90s, managed care was holding down costs in the middle of the 1990s. And they were doing it by means that a lot of people objected to. First of all, by saying you have to go to your primary care physician to go to a specialist. Doctors had to get their procedures approved with the insurance company. All of that stuff got shot down, and the control of costs, which came in the middle 90s, all faded away, and they went right back up again because they got legislative pressure. Legislators said, "My God, you can't. How can you say no? You've got to give these people stuff." So, but this is America, unfortunately.
And yet you'd probably have to say, you'd have to say that the answer to your question, what price better health, would be any price whatsoever on the part of most people.
Well, I think that's very much the case. In fact, I think one of the worst things I've heard over the years is that people will say, I basically agree with you. That makes a lot of sense. This is what we should do. But if it's my wife, my spouse, my girlfriend, well, that's different. Well, to have a nation where everybody wants it all to be different with themselves and their loved ones, you can't have a European healthcare system. I think they better understand over there that if you want to have a fair, equitable system that everybody has decent access to, you can't put your wife and your loved ones first. They are on a par with every other citizen.
But you also don't think we're going to do that in this country?
It's very hard to be optimistic. I mean, again, the Democrats, some of the candidates are talking about it, and even George Bush is sort of getting nervous about that issue. But it's, after watching this for 50 years, and every 10 years, somebody says, we've got a huge crisis in healthcare. Something's got to happen now. Well, we seem to be happy muddling through a crisis rather than actually engaging in any serious reform.
We just have a couple of minutes left.
Yep.
You do spend a lot of time abroad.
Yes.
How successful are other countries?
They're much better. They're much more successful on cost of healthcare. They spend less per capita than we do, and less as a percentage of their gross domestic product. They're also better on the outcomes. People live, America is not at the top of lists of longevity. There are a lot of countries, Canada's much better off than we are. So they basically get better health outcomes at a lower cost. That's the simple story of the European healthcare. So by almost any index, we have a poor healthcare system.
And what's the difference there? What's the missing ingredient? Private enterprise?
The missing ingredient is that we have a system which is very heavily a private system, private health insurers, and a lot of people who believe very much in the market as the way to run things. And George Bush is right at the top of the list these days.
Don't you think that the answer then, since the answer to your question, what price better health, is in this country any price, that we're going to take the profit out of medicine?
Well, I think that's about the most utopian thing I can think of to say in this world, given the fact that we have failed for at least a century to do this, and it is getting worse, not better. So
you think that it'll be easier to say only so much in terms of
no,
what
that's
price?
going to be equally hard too. The difficulty I think with the American healthcare system is it's very hard to imagine any sort of semi-reasonable solution that will be successful. Even the market people who believe that we should make much more profit-oriented private enterprise, they're not going to win either, because we don't want to go that far. On the other hand, we don't like the government either, so we won't go in that direction, so we end up with the worst of all worlds.
Well, Dan, when we're in our 90s, we'll keep talking about this. Thanks, Dan Callahan, for joining me today. And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. If you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck. The Open Mind owes much to its guests, like the one today, who for nearly a half-century now have generously interrupted busy schedules to share their insights into the challenges Americans face in so many important areas of our national life. Now, the objective of our conversations has always been to provide the light of reasoned discourse, rather than the heat of verbal battle, and that objective surfaces clearly in this first volume of my new Conversational History of Modern America, edited by Mark Jaffe and with a foreword by Mario Cuomo, an Avalon book published by Carolyn Graff. Here are memorable words from Martin Luther King, Jonas Salk, Malcolm X, Betty Friedan, Bill Moyers, Rudolph Giuliani, Thurgood Marshall, Gloria Steinem, and dozens more. Read the book. I think you'll like it. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, Phyllis and Richard L. Gelb, the Malkin Fund, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America and Rudolph Finn.